They say marriage is an equal partnership, but no one ever warns you about the invisible scale. No one tells you how easily the weight shifts. They do not mention how quickly you learn to carry the heavier side just to keep the whole house from tipping over. My name is Amanda. I am 38 years old. I stood in the center of my kitchen staring at the glossy granite countertops. The digital clock on the microwave glowed with bright green numbers. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. My lower back throbbed with a familiar dull ache. I pressed my hand against the side of my swollen belly. At 7 months pregnant, standing on the hard ceramic tile felt like running a marathon. I wiped a strand of damp hair away from my forehead. The oven radiated a thick, suffocating heat. Inside, a large beef roast sizzled in a heavy iron pan. I reached over and turned the dial on the stove down. A pot of potatoes boiled furiously, sending plumes of white steam into the warm air. I was absolutely exhausted. My feet were swollen inside my simple canvas shoes. I wanted nothing more than to lie down in my quiet bedroom. I wanted to close my eyes and listen to the gentle hum of the air conditioning. But rest was not an option today. Today was Sunday. In my husband's family, Sunday dinner was not a casual suggestion. It was a strict mandatory performance. Robert was currently sitting in a comfortable hotel room halfway across the country. He had flown to Chicago for a high-stakes corporate seminar. He kissed my cheek on Friday morning and promised to call. He left me entirely alone to host his mother Margaret and his younger sister Jessica. Margaret and Jessica came from a world of old money and effortless privilege. They lived in an exclusive neighborhood where the lawns were perfectly manicured by expensive landscaping crews. I grew up in a loud working-class home. My father wore heavy leather boots and worked double shifts at the factory. My mother bought our clothes from discount department stores. I was proud of my roots. I worked incredibly hard to build a career as a graphic designer. But to Margaret, I was always the girl from the wrong side of the tracks. I was the girl who got lucky when her successful son decided to settle down. I picked up a silver vegetable peeler. I grabbed another large carrot from the wooden cutting board. I scraped the rough skin away, watching the bright orange ribbons fall into the sink. I had spent the entire weekend preparing for this specific meal. I scrubbed the guest bathroom until the porcelain gleamed. I vacuumed the living room rug twice, making sure the vacuum lines were perfectly straight. Margaret noticed everything. She had a terrifying ability to spot a single speck of dust from across the room. I walked over to the tall wooden dining cabinet. Margaret only drank water from heavy crystal goblets. I reached up on my tiptoes, stretching my aching back. My fingers barely grazed the bottom shelf. I grabbed a sturdy wooden chair and pulled it over. Climbing up with a heavy pregnant belly was terrifying. But I did it. I wiped each glass carefully with a soft cloth. I could not risk a single water spot. Then there was the wine. Robert had sent me a message reminding me about Jessica and her wine. I had driven to 3 different specialty liquor stores yesterday afternoon. My ankles were swollen to twice their normal size by the time I returned home. But I finally found the exact obscure French red wine she demanded. It was currently breathing on the dining room table exactly the way she liked it. I chopped the carrot into small, even pieces. The sharp knife clicked rhythmically against the wood. Why am I doing this? I thought to myself. Why do I run myself ragged every single time they visit? The answer was simple. I loved Robert. I wanted his family to accept me. I wanted to bridge the massive invisible gap between our two worlds. For 5 long years, I swallowed my pride. I smiled through the subtle insults. I overcompensated by being the perfect accommodating hostess. The timer on the oven began to beep aggressively. I let out a heavy sigh. I grabbed 2 thick insulated oven mitts. I bent down slowly, feeling the heavy, uncomfortable pressure in my pelvis. I opened the heavy oven door. A wave of intense heat hit my face. I pulled the heavy roasting pan out, resting it carefully on the stovetop. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled the kitchen. It smelled beautiful, but my stomach churned with pure anxiety. I poured myself a glass of ice water. I leaned against the counter, letting the cold glass rest against my flushed cheek. My phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a text message from Robert. "Hope the dinner prep is going well," the message read. "Tell my mother I love her, and make sure Jessica gets the wine she likes." I stared at the glowing screen. A heavy knot formed in my throat. He was entirely disconnected from the reality of my exhaustion. He assumed everything was fine because I always made sure everything looked fine. I set the phone down without replying. I did not have the energy to type a cheerful response. The doorbell suddenly rang, chiming loudly through the quiet suburban house. My heart rate immediately spiked. I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed my hands down the front of my simple maternity dress. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the microwave door. I looked tired. I pinched my cheeks, trying to force some color into my pale skin. I walked slowly out of the kitchen and down the long hallway. The doorbell rang again, shorter and much more impatient this time. "I am coming." I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak. I reached the front door and wrapped my hand around the cool metal handle. I closed my eyes for one brief stolen second. I braced myself for the judgment. I pulled the heavy wooden door open, plastering a warm, entirely fake smile onto my exhausted face. Margaret stood on the porch wearing a crisp ivory cashmere coat. Jessica stood right beside her, scrolling on her phone, wearing designer leather boots. Neither of them offered a warm greeting or a simple smile. Margaret stepped inside, bringing a heavy cloud of expensive floral perfume with her. She looked Amanda up and down, her eyes lingering on the simple cotton maternity dress. "You look incredibly tired," Margaret said, handing over her heavy wool coat. "You really should try to keep yourself put together, especially when hosting family. Robert works so hard to provide a beautiful home for you. It is the least you can do to look presentable." I took the coat, feeling the heavy fabric weigh down my tired arms. "Thank you, Margaret," I replied quietly. "Please come into the dining room. Dinner is almost ready." Jessica walked past me without looking up from her glowing screen. "It smells like roasted garlic in here," Jessica muttered, wrinkling her perfectly contoured nose. "I hope the meal is not too heavy. You know my stomach cannot handle cheap, greasy food. I have a very delicate palate." I swallowed the massive lump of frustration forming in my throat. I hung their expensive coats in the hallway closet. I walked back into the hot kitchen to carry the heavy roasting pan. My lower back screamed in absolute protest, but I ignored it, pushing through the familiar pain. The dining room table was set perfectly. The crystal glasses gleamed beautifully under the warm chandelier light. Margaret sat at the very head of the table, a position usually reserved for Robert. Jessica sat across from her, inspecting her silver fork, holding it up to the light as if looking for a smudge. I carried the heavy iron pan, placing it carefully in the center of the table. I walked back and forth to the kitchen 5 separate times. I brought the warm potatoes, the glazed carrots, the fresh bread, and the crystal pitcher of ice water. By the time I finally sat down in my chair, my breathing was terribly shallow and fast. The baby kicked hard right against my ribs, a sharp reminder of the physical toll I was taking. Margaret took a small, delicate bite of the beef roast. "It is a bit overdone," Margaret noted, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. "But I suppose, considering you do not have domestic help, we must lower our standard expectations." I stared down at my porcelain plate. I did not have the energy to defend my cooking. I reached out and poured the expensive French wine into Jessica's crystal glass. She took a tiny sip and sighed dramatically. "It is a decent vintage," Jessica said, swirling the dark red liquid around the glass. "But you let it breathe for too long. It completely ruins the complex, earthy notes. I guess you cannot expect a graphic designer to truly understand the subtle nuances of a fine Bordeaux." I set the heavy green wine bottle down on the wooden table. Usually, this is the exact moment I would apologize profusely. I would rush back to the kitchen in a panic and try to find a different bottle to appease her. I would shrink my own presence down to make them feel larger and more important. Margaret leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands flat on the table. "Tell me, Amanda, how is your father doing these days?" Margaret asked, her tone dripping with a terrible false concern. "Is he still working at that loud, dirty manufacturing factory? It must be so completely exhausting performing manual labor at his advanced age." Robert offered to pay for a financial retirement seminar for him, but I suppose working-class pride gets in the way of common sense. The cruel comment was designed to sting. It was a highly calculated reminder that I did not belong in their elite world. I looked directly at Margaret. I looked at the heavy, flawless diamond ring sparkling brightly on her finger. I looked at Jessica, who was rolling her eyes, completely bored by the mere mention of my working-class family. I felt a sharp, sudden cramp deep in my lower abdomen. The intense physical pain finally pierced through the heavy emotional fog. I looked down at my own hands. They were red and raw from scrubbing the ceramic floors all morning. My simple gold wedding ring felt incredibly tight on my swollen, tired finger. I thought about Robert sitting comfortably in a luxury hotel room in downtown Chicago. He was likely drinking craft cocktails with his corporate colleagues. He was entirely safe, insulated from the venom of his own mother and sister. He left me here alone and pregnant to be his personal shock absorber. He fully expected me to swallow the insults and smile gracefully just so he did not have to deal with the inevitable family conflict. Something deep inside me suddenly snapped. It was not a loud, violent break. It was a quiet, profound, permanent shift. A heavy, invisible curtain finally dropped. I looked at the half-empty gravy boat sitting near Margaret's plate. "Oh, Amanda," Margaret sighed, tapping her perfectly polished fingernail against the hard wood. "I need more gravy for my potatoes, and Jessica needs her water glass refilled immediately. Be a dear and run to the kitchen to get more." I sat perfectly still. The silence in the dining room stretched for one long, incredibly uncomfortable second. I did not move to stand up. I did not offer a sweet apology. I leaned back heavily in my wooden chair and let out a long, slow breath. I rested both of my hands protectively on my pregnant belly. "The gravy is right there, Margaret," I said, my voice completely calm and eerily steady. "You can easily reach it yourself. And the large water pitcher is sitting right behind you on the sideboard, Jessica." Margaret completely froze. Her silver fork stopped suspended halfway to her mouth. She stared at me in absolute, unadulterated shock. Jessica actually looked up from her bright phone screen, her eyes wide with total disbelief. In 5 long years of marriage, I had never once refused a direct request from them. I had never spoken to them without a thick protective layer of deferential sweetness. "Excuse me," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low, threatening pitch. "What did you just say to me?" I looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes, refusing to look away. "I am exhausted, Margaret," I replied, not breaking eye contact for a single second. "I cooked this entire meal. I cleaned this entire house by myself. My back hurts immensely, and I am finally sitting down. If you want more gravy, you are going to have to reach across the table and pass it yourself." Jessica scoffed loudly, crossing her arms. "Wow, Jessica muttered, shaking her head. Robert warned us you were feeling a bit hormonal this week, but this is just plain rude. You are being completely unreasonable, Amanda. I did not argue with her. I did not try to defend my actions. I simply picked up my fork and took a slow, deliberate bite of my cold dinner. The food tasted completely bland in my mouth, but the simple act of eating felt like a massive, victorious rebellion. I chewed slowly, completely, ignoring the furious, burning stares directed at my face. Margaret abruptly dropped her linen napkin directly onto her half-eaten plate. Well, Margaret announced, standing up quickly, her voice trembling with manufactured dramatic outrage. I have never been spoken to with such incredible blatant disrespect in my own son's house. I will be calling Robert the exact moment we leave this dreadful place. I smiled softly, picking up my glass and taking a refreshing sip of my ice water. Please do, Margaret, I said quietly, feeling a strange weight lift from my shoulders. Tell him I said hello. The rest of the evening dinner was entirely consumed by a thick, suffocating, angry silence. Margaret and Jessica ate their food quickly, their faces flushed bright red with anger. When they finally finished, they did not offer to help clear the messy table. They grabbed their expensive winter coats from the hallway closet and left the house quickly without saying a single word of goodbye. The heavy front door slammed violently shut behind them, shaking the walls. I sat entirely alone in the quiet, empty dining room. The large table was completely covered in dirty, greasy plates and half-empty crystal wine glasses. Normally, I would immediately start cleaning the mess. I would spend the next 2 solid hours scrubbing the heavy iron pots and wiping down the granite counters, absolutely terrified that Robert would come home to a messy, disorganized house. But tonight was entirely different. The invisible, crushing burden felt suddenly wonderfully lighter. I stood up slowly, stretching my aching, tired back. I walked right past the messy dining room table. I walked past the kitchen, leaving the greasy roasting pan still sitting on the cold stove. I reached out and turned the bright overhead lights completely off. I walked slowly down the long hallway, stepped into my quiet bedroom, and shut the door firmly behind me. I climbed into the soft bed, pulling the heavy blankets all the way up to my chin. I closed my tired eyes, feeling a strange, brand new sense of absolute peace wash over me. The unfair system was finally broken. I had officially decided to stop trying to fix it. The morning sun poured softly through the bedroom window. I woke up feeling remarkably rested. The familiar heavy dread that usually sat in my chest was completely gone. I walked into the kitchen. The dirty dishes from the Sunday dinner were still sitting exactly where I left them. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I made myself a simple bowl of oatmeal and sat at the small kitchen island. My phone buzzed, vibrating loudly against the granite counter. It was a calendar notification. It reminded me that Margaret had a birthday coming up in exactly 2 weeks. For the past 5 years, this specific notification triggered a massive wave of anxiety. I used to spend hours driving to high-end boutiques downtown. I would agonize over buying the perfect expensive silk scarf or a rare bottle of imported perfume. I would buy thick, glossy wrapping paper and carefully tie a perfectly symmetrical ribbon around the box. I would buy a beautiful card and forge Robert's signature at the bottom so his mother would think he actually remembered her special day. I stared at the bright digital reminder glowing on my phone screen. I took a slow sip of my warm coffee. I reached out, tapped the screen, and deleted the event completely. I did not set a backup alarm. I did not add a shopping list to my digital notes. If Robert wanted to buy his mother a birthday gift, he was going to have to remember it completely on his own. An hour later, the phone rang again. It was Robert calling from the airport in Chicago. He was waiting to board his flight home. "Hey, sweetheart," Robert said, his voice sounding entirely relaxed over the noisy background chatter of the terminal. "I am just grabbing a quick coffee before my flight boards. How was the Sunday dinner with my mother and Jessica?" I leaned back in my chair, resting my hand on my pregnant belly. "It was fine," I replied, my voice completely neutral. "Just fine?" Robert asked, sounding mildly confused by my short answer. "My mother sent me a very strange text message last night. She said you were acting hormonal and completely unreasonable." "What exactly happened, Amanda?" I felt a familiar spark of frustration try to ignite in my chest, but I quickly extinguished it. I refused to play the role of the frantic defending wife anymore. "Nothing happened, Robert," I said calmly, tracing the edge of my ceramic coffee mug. "I cooked the dinner, they ate the food, and then they left. If your mother has a specific complaint, you should really call her directly and ask her about it." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Robert was entirely used to me giving him a detailed, anxious play-by-play of every single family interaction. He relied on me to interpret his mother's passive-aggressive behavior and tell him exactly how to fix it. "I do not want to call her right now," Robert sighed, sounding incredibly annoyed by the mere suggestion. "You know how dramatic she gets when she feels slighted. Just tell me what you did wrong, so I can buy her some flowers and smooth the whole thing over." I closed my eyes. The sheer entitlement in his voice was breathtaking. He automatically assumed that I was the one who did something wrong. He automatically expected me to manage the emotional fallout. "I did not do anything wrong, Robert," I stated firmly, feeling my heart beat a little faster. "I am extremely tired, and I need to lie down. Have a safe flight home." I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I set the device face down on the cool granite counter. I did not feel guilty. I felt an incredible, empowering sense of relief. The rest of the week slipped by in a quiet, peaceful blur. I entirely stopped managing the invisible emotional calendar of our marriage. I did not send Jessica a text message asking about her recent job interview. I did not call Margaret to confirm our attendance at her upcoming country club luncheon. I completely dropped the heavy invisible rope that tethered me to their endless demands. Instead, I focused entirely on my own well-being. I took long, warm baths in the evening. I read books sitting in the comfortable chair in the nursery. I went to bed early and allowed my exhausted body to finally heal. When Robert finally arrived home from his business trip, the atmosphere in the house was vastly different. He walked through the front door, dropping his heavy leather suitcase in the hallway. He expected to find a hot meal waiting on the stove and a perfectly clean house. He expected me to greet him at the door with a warm smile and a detailed update on his family schedule. Instead, he found me sitting comfortably on the living room sofa, wearing my oldest, softest sweatpants. I was reading a baby name book and eating a bowl of fresh fruit. The dirty dishes from his mother's dinner had finally been loaded into the dishwasher, but the floors were not vacuumed. The mail was piled up unceremoniously on the kitchen counter. Robert stood in the doorway of the living room looking completely bewildered. He loosened his expensive silk tie, staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. "Hello, Robert," I said, not bothering to stand up. "Welcome home." He looked around the slightly messy room, a deep frown forming on his face. "Is everything okay, Amanda?" he asked, his tone laced with mild irritation. "The house looks like a complete disaster area. And why did you not remind me to call my mother yesterday? She left me 3 angry voicemails while I was flying." I turned the page of my book, not breaking my relaxed posture. "I am pregnant, Robert," I replied calmly. "I was tired, so I did not clean. And your mother is an adult. If she wants to talk to you, she knows exactly how to dial your number. I am no longer your personal secretary." Robert stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He had absolutely no idea how to process this new, unapologetic version of his wife. The silent protest had officially begun, and the heavy foundation of our marriage was already starting to crack. The very next morning after Robert left for his downtown office, my older sister Lauren came over. She walked through the front door carrying 2 large paper cups filled with decaffeinated coffee. Lauren is exactly 4 years older than me. She has the same dark curly hair and the same stubborn, highly practical mindset that our father passed down to us. She works as a high school science teacher, and she has absolutely zero patience for manufactured drama. I was sitting at the quiet kitchen table folding a small stack of tiny pastel yellow baby clothes. Lauren set the warm coffee cups down on the polished wooden table. She took one long, carefully assessing look at my face and pulled out a chair. "You look entirely different today," Amanda Lauren observed, narrowing her dark eyes. "You do not have that usual frantic energy vibrating around you. What exactly happened this weekend? I picked up a tiny, cotton baby sock." I smoothed the incredibly soft fabric between my tired fingers. I took a deep breath, letting the warm, rich aroma of the coffee fill the quiet kitchen. "I completely dropped the rope, Lauren," I confessed quietly. "I stopped trying to please them. I refused to serve Margaret at dinner, and I permanently deleted her birthday reminder from my digital calendar." Lauren leaned back in her wooden chair, a slow, incredibly proud smile spreading across her face. "It is about time," she said, taking a slow sip of her hot coffee. "I was honestly starting to wonder how long you were going to let those entitled women treat you like a hired servant." I set the tiny baby sock down, feeling a sudden heavy wave of emotion wash over me. "It is not just them," I admitted, my voice cracking slightly. "It is Robert. He came home yesterday and he was actually angry at me for not reminding him to call his mother. He looked at me as if I had deliberately failed my primary duty as his wife. He completely relies on me to manage the entire emotional landscape of his family, and he never once acknowledges the heavy, invisible toll it takes on me." Lauren reached across the wide table and placed her warm, comforting hand directly over mine. "You have been wildly overcompensating for 5 long years," Amanda Lauren said gently. "Ever since the day you got engaged, you have been desperately trying to prove to Margaret and Jessica that you are worthy of their precious family name. You hid your working-class roots because their snide comments made you feel incredibly small." Hot tears pricked the corners of my tired eyes. She was entirely right. I remembered the agonizing pressure of our wedding day. I planned every single minute detail, trying desperately to meet Margaret's impossibly high standards. I chose the expensive imported white roses she demanded, even though they completely drained my personal savings account. I seated her wealthy friends at the most prominent tables near the front, while my own hardworking family was pushed toward the back of the reception hall. I did it all just to avoid a terrifying confrontation. I sacrificed my own joy on my own wedding day just to keep the fragile, toxic peace. From that single disastrous moment forward, I made a silent, deeply damaging vow. I vowed to never give them a reason to look down on me again. I learned all about their expensive imported wines and their exclusive gated country clubs. I memorized their obscure, highly specific dietary preferences. I spent countless hours researching the exact brands of perfume and the specific luxury designers they preferred. I effectively erased my own vibrant personality to become the perfect, accommodating, invisible addition to their elite world. And I did it all entirely alone because Robert blindly refused to see the subtle, insidious cruelty hiding constantly behind the fake smiles of his mother. I was so incredibly desperate to make him happy, I whispered, wiping a stray tear from my pale cheek. I thought if I just worked a little harder, if I just anticipated their every single unspoken need, they would eventually love me. I thought they would eventually see that I was a genuinely good person. Lauren squeezed my hand firmly. You are a wonderful person. Amanda Lauren corrected, her voice thick with fierce, protective, sisterly loyalty. But you cannot buy genuine respect with endless, quiet servitude. They do not look down on you because you lack generational wealth. They look down on you because they are deeply insecure, intensely arrogant people. And Robert allows it to happen because it keeps his daily life perfectly smooth and completely comfortable. I looked down at the soft pile of folded baby clothes. The bright pastel colors reminded me of the fragile, innocent life currently growing inside me. I am bringing a daughter into this messy world in exactly 2 months, I said, feeling a sudden surge of profound maternal strength. I cannot let her grow up watching her mother cower in the intimidating presence of her own grandmother. I cannot let her believe that a woman's true value is measured by how much blatant disrespect she can quietly, politely endure. Lauren nodded in absolute silent agreement. So what is the actual plan now? She asked, leaning forward with intense, curious interest. There is no grand dramatic plan, Lauren, I replied, picking up my warm ceramic coffee cup. I am simply going to exist comfortably in my own home. I am going to focus entirely on my growing baby and my own physical health. Robert can either step up and manage his own toxic, demanding family, or he can slowly drown in their endless complaints. I am no longer going to be his dedicated, invisible human shield. We sat together in the quiet, sunlit kitchen for another full hour. We talked affectionately about our childhood and our late father and the incredibly strong, resilient values he deliberately taught us. By the time Lauren finally hugged me goodbye and walked out the heavy front door, the lingering, suffocating anxiety in my chest had entirely vanished. I had spoken my painful, guarded truth out loud to someone who truly, deeply understood. The heavy, lonely isolation of the past 5 years was finally permanently broken. The peace did not last very long. Later that same evening, Robert walked into the kitchen holding his sleek cell phone tightly in his right hand. He looked incredibly agitated. He paced back and forth across the ceramic floor, rubbing the back of his neck. I sat at the kitchen island, quietly eating a small bowl of yogurt. I did not ask him what was wrong. I knew exactly who he had just been talking to. I just spent 45 minutes on the phone listening to my mother cry. Robert said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. She is entirely convinced that you absolutely hate her, Amanda. She said you completely ignored her at Sunday dinner and that you have not answered a single one of her text messages all week. I took a slow, deliberate bite of my yogurt. I have been extremely tired, Robert, I replied calmly. I needed to rest. He stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the granite counter. Resting is fine. Amanda. Robert sighed, dragging a hand across his tired face. But you know exactly how she gets. She said Jessica feels totally unwelcome in our home now, and my mother's birthday is next week. She specifically asked me what you were planning for her country club luncheon, and I had absolutely no idea what to say because you have not mentioned a single word about it. I set my silver spoon down on the cool counter. I did not mention it because I am not planning anything for her birthday. I stated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any apology. I deleted the reminder from my calendar. If you want to celebrate her, you need to organize it yourself. Robert stared at me, his eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated shock. What are you talking about? he demanded, stepping closer to the kitchen island. You always handle her birthday. You always buy the gift and make the reservations. I do not have the time to plan a luncheon, Amanda. I am working 50 hours a week trying to secure a massive corporate merger. I looked directly into his eyes, refusing to shrink back. And I am currently 7 months pregnant, Robert, I replied calmly. I am carrying your child and my body is exhausted. I cannot spend my limited energy managing the fragile ego of a woman who constantly belittles me in my own home. Robert threw his hands up in the air, a gesture of absolute, utter exasperation. Belittles you? He scoffed loudly. Amanda, please stop being so incredibly dramatic. She is just an older woman from a very different generation. She has high standards and sometimes she lacks a filter. But she does not mean any actual harm. You just take everything so personally. The blatant invalidation stung deeply. He was doing exactly what he always did. He was minimizing my very real pain to excuse her terrible behavior. He was protecting his mother at my direct expense. It is not dramatic to expect basic respect. I said, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts to stay entirely calm. She mocked my father and his working-class job right at this very dinner table. Jessica insulted my career and my intelligence. And you sat in a hotel room hundreds of miles away, completely unaware, because I have spent the last 5 years absorbing all of their venom so you would never have to deal with it. Robert shook his head, looking completely defensive and deeply annoyed. So this is what we are doing now? He asked, his tone dripping with bitter sarcasm. You are just going to hold a massive grudge over a few clumsy comments and completely disrupt our entire family dynamic. You know how much stress I am under at the office, Amanda. I rely on you to keep things smooth on the home front. I need you to be the bigger person here and just apologize to her so we can move on from this ridiculous standoff. He was actually asking me to apologize. He wanted me to call the very woman who insulted my family and beg for her forgiveness just so his life could return to normal. I am not apologizing, Robert, I said, my voice dropping back to a quiet, unbreakable whisper. I am completely done being the bigger person. The invisible shield is gone. If your mother has a problem with me, she can tell me to my face. And if you want to keep the peace so desperately, you can learn how to manage her yourself. I stood up from the kitchen stool. I picked up my empty ceramic bowl and placed it carefully in the metal sink. I did not wait for his response. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing there in the heavy, uncomfortable silence. He did not follow me. He stayed in the kitchen, completely trapped in the sudden, terrifying realization that the comfortable, easy system he had enjoyed for years was fundamentally broken. He blamed me for rocking the boat. He failed to see that I was simply refusing to row the heavy boat completely by myself anymore. The next morning, the reality of my silent strike fully settled over the quiet house. For 5 years, my morning routine was entirely dedicated to Robert. I used to wake up at 6 in the morning just to brew his specific dark roast coffee. I used to lay out his tailored suits and make sure his leather shoes were perfectly polished. I would pack his sleek leather briefcase with fresh fruit and his daily vitamins. But today, I stayed in the warm bed until my own body naturally woke up. It was nearly 8 in the morning when I finally walked into the bright kitchen. I did not make a full pot of dark roast coffee. I simply made 1 small cup of herbal peppermint tea for myself. I toasted a single piece of whole wheat bread and sat comfortably at the kitchen island taking my prenatal vitamins. 10 minutes later, Robert rushed down the wooden stairs. He was wearing his expensive suit trousers, but he was holding a wrinkled white dress shirt in his hand. He looked completely frantic, his hair still wet from his quick shower. Amanda, Robert said, his voice laced with absolute panic. Where are my freshly pressed shirts? I have a massive presentation at 9 in the morning and my closet is entirely empty. I took a slow, calm sip of my warm tea. I did not take your clothes to the dry cleaners this week, Robert, I replied smoothly. The heavy plastic bags hurt my lower back. Robert stared at me, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. You did not drop off the dry cleaning, he repeated, his voice rising in sheer frustration. Amanda, you always handle the dry cleaning. How am I supposed to go to a corporate boardroom looking like a complete mess? You can drop them off yourself on your way home tonight, I suggested, turning the page of my baby magazine. Or you can quickly iron that shirt right now. The iron is in the laundry room. He let out a loud, dramatic groan. He threw the wrinkled shirt over his broad shoulder and stomped away toward the laundry room. I listened to the loud, aggressive clanking of the metal ironing board echoing down the long hallway. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. He was a grown man fully capable of pressing his own clothes. The unraveling of his perfect, comfortable routine continued rapidly throughout the week. On Wednesday evening, Robert opened the heavy stainless steel refrigerator looking for his expensive imported sparkling water. He shifted the glass jars and the plastic containers, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Did we run out of my sparkling water? Robert called out from the kitchen. I was sitting in the comfortable living room chair, resting my swollen feet on the soft ottoman. Yes, I answered loudly. We ran out on Monday. He closed the heavy refrigerator door and walked into the living room. Well, why did you not pick more up when you went to the grocery store yesterday? He asked, genuinely baffled by the empty shelves. You know I drink a bottle every single night after work. I only bought the groceries that I specifically needed, Robert, I said calmly, looking up from my book. The cases of glass water bottles are incredibly heavy. I am not risking my health or the health of our baby to lug heavy boxes from the car. If you want your specific drinks, you need to go to the store and buy them yourself. He ran a frustrated hand through his thick hair. He looked around the slightly messy living room. The large pile of mail sitting on the entryway table had grown into a chaotic, unorganized mountain. His heavy golf clubs were still sitting exactly where he dropped them in the front hallway. The invisible magical fairy who usually kept his entire life running with seamless perfection had officially quit her demanding job. On Friday morning, another critical system completely failed. Robert had a routine dental cleaning scheduled at exactly 8 in the morning. Usually, I would remind him 3 separate times. I would pack his travel toothbrush in his briefcase and leave a bright yellow sticky note on the bathroom mirror. This time, I did absolutely nothing. He rushed out the front door at 7:30, completely oblivious to his own personal schedule. The dental office called our house phone 30 minutes later, charging us a hefty cancellation fee. When Robert finally realized his massive mistake, he sent me a long string of angry text messages. He blamed me entirely for not managing his personal digital calendar. I read the text messages sitting peacefully on the outdoor patio. I did not type a frantic, desperately worded apology. I simply set the phone down and closed my eyes, enjoying the warm morning sun. His lack of personal responsibility was no longer my emergency. This is completely ridiculous, Amanda Robert muttered that evening, pacing back and forth across the soft rug. You are acting incredibly petty. You are intentionally making my life difficult just to punish me for a tiny disagreement with my mother. It is not a punishment, Robert, I replied quietly, feeling the undeniable truth of my own words. I am simply matching your level of effort. For 5 years, I have managed every single detail of your personal life. I bought your clothes, I organized your schedule, and I catered to your demanding family. I did it all because I thought we were a true partnership. I placed my book down on the small wooden side table. I looked directly into his tired, confused eyes. But a true partnership is not built on the silent, exhausted sacrifices of one person. I continued, my voice steady and completely clear. You expect me to carry the entire mental load of this household while you focus solely on your career. You rely on my invisible labor to make your life perfectly easy. And the moment I stop overextending myself, you immediately accuse me of being petty. He opened his mouth to argue, but he had absolutely no valid defense. The undeniable physical evidence of my absence was scattered all around him. He realized for the very first time in our marriage that his comfortable, effortless life was entirely built on my constant, exhausting physical effort. I am tired, Robert, I said softly, ending the conversation completely. I am going to bed early. You can figure out your own dinner tonight. I stood up slowly, supporting my heavy, pregnant belly, and walked out of the living room. I left him standing alone, surrounded by the mounting household chores and the undeniable reality of his own absolute negligence. The uneasy standoff in our house lasted for 2 full weeks. We moved around each other like 2 quiet strangers sharing the same physical space. Robert finally learned how to operate the heavy washing machine. He started buying his own expensive sparkling water, and he eventually realized that the mail did not magically sort itself. But he was still quietly waiting for me to apologize. He honestly believed that my silent protest was just a temporary hormonal phase. He thought I would eventually snap out of it and return to my proper place as the exhausted manager of his daily life. He was spectacularly wrong. The real test of our new fragile dynamic arrived on a Tuesday evening. I was sitting at the kitchen island, slowly drinking a cup of warm, decaffeinated tea. Robert walked into the kitchen carrying his sleek leather briefcase. He looked incredibly stressed. He dropped the heavy briefcase on the floor and pulled a thick printed spreadsheet from his suit pocket. He placed the crisp paper directly on the granite counter, sliding it carefully toward me. I looked down at the dense rows of names and dietary restrictions. "What is this, Robert?" I asked, not making any move to pick the paper up. "It is the final guest list for the annual family charity gala," Robert explained, running a tired hand through his hair. "It is only 3 weeks away, Amanda. My mother is absolutely panicking. We need to finalize the catering numbers by Friday, and we still need to order the massive imported floral centerpieces. I need you to call the French bakery tomorrow morning and secure the custom dessert towers. And please double-check the seating chart because Jessica absolutely refuses to sit next to my uncle." I stared at the thick spreadsheet. For the past 5 years, I was the invisible event planner for every single grand occasion his family hosted. Margaret took all the public credit, soaking up the praise from her wealthy friends, while I spent weeks making frantic phone calls and agonizing over minute details. I was the one who negotiated with the expensive caterers. I was the one who tracked down the rare seasonal flowers. I did all the heavy, stressful lifting so Margaret could effortlessly glide into the ballroom looking like a flawless, aristocratic queen. I took a slow, calm sip of my warm tea. I gently pushed the printed spreadsheet right back across the smooth granite counter. "I am not doing this, Robert," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of any emotional wavering. Robert frowned, leaning heavily against the island. "What do you mean you are not doing this?" he asked, his tone laced with immediate defensive irritation. "You always handle the gala logistics, Amanda. My mother completely relies on your organizational skills. She specifically asked me to make sure you were on top of the vendor deadlines." I looked directly into his eyes. "Then you should probably call your mother right now and tell her she needs to hire a professional event planner," I replied quietly. "Because I am currently 30 weeks pregnant. My ankles are incredibly swollen, and my lower back is in constant agony. I am not spending my limited energy managing a massive high society party for a woman who disrespects me in my own dining room. Robert's face flushed bright red with sudden intense anger. Amanda, this is my family annual charity event. He raised his voice, hitting his hand flat against the hard counter. It honors my late father. It is incredibly important to our entire social circle. You cannot just completely abandon your responsibilities right at the final hour. You are my wife. You are expected to help manage these things. I felt a cold, sharp spike of absolute clarity pierce right through my chest. He was finally saying the quiet part out loud. I am your wife, Robert. I agreed softly, maintaining perfect, unbreakable eye contact. I am not your unpaid administrative assistant. I am not your mother personal party planner. I only ever did those things because I wanted to feel accepted. I thought my exhausting invisible labor would finally earn me a place at your table. But it never did. It only made me a convenient disposable tool for your family to use. That is entirely unfair, and you know it, Robert argued, his voice shaking with desperate frustration. You are taking this whole silent strike thing way too far. If you do not help me organize this gala, my mother is going to be completely humiliated in front of her friends. The entire event will be a total disaster, and she will blame me for it. I picked up my warm teacup, entirely unfazed by his mounting panic. Then I suggest you start making those vendor phone calls tonight, Robert, I said calmly, because I am officially retiring from the family management business. I stood up from the kitchen stool, leaving the heavy spreadsheet sitting abandoned on the counter. I did not raise my voice, and I did not cry. I simply walked away, leaving him to face the overwhelming monumental task of actually managing his own family. I walked slowly toward the living room, but I could hear his heavy, frustrated breathing echoing in the quiet kitchen. He snatched his cell phone from his pocket, and I heard him aggressively dialing a number. He was calling his mother, completely frantic, trying to explain that the invisible safety net was permanently gone. I sat down heavily on the soft sofa, resting my hands on my large belly. The baby kicked gently, a sweet rhythmic reminder of the only priority I had left. The grand family gala was going to happen whether they were ready or not. And for the very first time in my entire marriage, I was going completely off the clock. 3 grueling weeks passed, filled with endless, frantic phone calls between Robert and his mother. The night of the grand charity gala finally arrived. The lavish event was held in the massive, opulent ballroom of the downtown country club. Normally, I would arrive at the venue 3 full hours before the first guest even stepped through the door. I would be running around in flat shoes, adjusting the heavy silk table runners, checking the tiny handwritten name cards, and soothing the anxious, high-strung catering manager. I would be sweating panicked and entirely exhausted before the party even officially started. Tonight, however, I arrived exactly on time as a completely normal guest. I wore a beautiful, flowing dark blue maternity gown. I took my time getting ready, carefully curling my dark hair and applying a bold red lipstick. When Robert and I finally walked through the heavy brass double doors of the country club, the chaotic energy in the room was absolutely palpable. Robert was sweating profusely inside his expensive tailored tuxedo. He kept checking his bright phone screen every 5 seconds, completely consumed by the massive logistical nightmare he had been forced to inherit. We stepped into the grand ballroom, and the immediate glaring disasters were entirely obvious to anyone paying attention. The massive imported floral centerpieces were completely wrong. Margaret had explicitly demanded tall, dramatic towers of white orchids. Instead, the tables were decorated with short, incredibly dense arrangements of pink hydrangeas. The French dessert towers were noticeably missing from the corners of the room. The elegant acoustic string quartet that usually played softly near the entrance was nowhere to be found. Robert dragged his hand nervously across his slick-styled hair. "Oh my God," Robert muttered, his eyes darting frantically around the disorganized room. "The caterers set up the wrong buffet stations. And where is the lighting technician? The room is incredibly dark." I stood perfectly still, resting my small silver clutch against my stomach. I did not rush forward to fix a single thing. "It looks like you have a lot to manage tonight, Robert," I said, offering him a polite, entirely detached smile. "I am going to find my seat and ask a waiter for a glass of ice water. Good luck." I walked away from him, navigating through the growing crowd of wealthy elite guests. I found my assigned seat at a table near the very back of the room. It was a clear, unmistakable demotion orchestrated entirely by Margaret. In previous years, I was forced to sit at the primary head table, acting as her personal assistant, fetching her drinks and managing her schedule. Tonight, she had banished me to the shadows, a petty punishment for my sudden refusal to serve her. I sat down heavily in the padded chair, feeling incredibly comfortable in my absolute isolation. I watched the absolute chaos unfold from a safe, quiet distance. Margaret was pacing furiously near the front of the stage, wearing a heavily beaded silver gown. She was aggressively waving her hands, shouting at a terrified young catering assistant. Her perfect aristocratic facade was completely cracking under the intense pressure. Jessica was standing near the empty dessert tables, furiously typing on her phone, looking profoundly embarrassed by the disorganized, amateurish feel of the entire event. Without my invisible, meticulous labor holding the fragile event together, the massive cracks in their perfect family image were fully exposed to the public. The dinner service was delayed by a full 45 minutes. The wealthy guests grew visibly restless, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs and checking their expensive watches. When the food finally arrived, it was lukewarm, and the portions were entirely mismatched. I ate my cold chicken breast slowly, watching Robert practically run across the ballroom floor. He was desperately trying to placate angry donors and fix the endless stream of sudden emergencies. He looked completely exhausted, his expensive tuxedo jacket discarded, and his bow tie hanging loosely around his neck. He was finally experiencing just a tiny fraction of the immense crushing burden I had carried alone for 5 long years. A few older women wrapped in heavy, expensive shawls walked past my table. I overheard them whispering loudly about the terrible state of the gala. They criticized the cheap pink flowers and the absolutely dreadful service. They wondered aloud if Margaret was finally losing her pristine high society touch. I took a slow sip of my ice water, feeling a strange, profound sense of absolute vindication. The illusion of their effortless superiority was completely shattered. They thought my background made me inferior, but the undeniable truth was staring them right in the face. They were completely, hopelessly lost without the hard-working, dedicated daughter of a factory worker holding their fragile world together. I rested my hands on my belly, feeling the baby move gently. The evening was a total, unmitigated disaster, and I had absolutely nothing to do with it. The disastrous gala dragged on painfully slow and entirely disorganized. After the awkward, lukewarm dinner, the remaining guests gathered near the center of the ballroom for the mandatory family toasts. I remained seated at my distant table, my tired feet throbbing inside my low heels. I wanted nothing more than to go home and sleep, but leaving before the family speeches would cause a massive public scandal. Robert finally managed to get the microphone working. A loud screeching burst of audio feedback echoed painfully through the large ballroom, making several wealthy guests cover their ears in disgust. Robert apologized profusely, his face flushed red with sheer embarrassment. He handed the silver microphone to his mother. Margaret stepped up to the small podium. She tried to project her usual flawless elegance, but her smile was tight and deeply forced. She thanked her wealthy friends for attending and offered a few brief generic words about her late husband. She rushed through the speech quickly, clearly desperate to end the humiliating, chaotic evening. When she finished, the polite applause was noticeably thin and unenthusiastic. She handed the microphone to Jessica. Jessica stood in the center of the stage wearing a bright, incredibly expensive designer dress. She looked out at the disappointed crowd, her eyes narrowing with intense defensive frustration. She hated looking foolish, and she desperately needed someone else to absorb the massive public blame. Her eyes scanned the dark ballroom, skipping right over the wealthy donors, until they finally locked onto me sitting quietly in the back shadows. A cold, malicious smirk slowly spread across Jessica's perfectly contoured face. She tapped the microphone, drawing the immediate sharp attention of every single guest in the room. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Jessica began, her voice dripping with absolute sugary venom. "We know there were a few unfortunate logistical hiccups this evening. It takes an incredible amount of refined taste and absolute dedication to pull off an event of this massive scale." The heavy silence in the ballroom grew incredibly tense. People started to turn their heads, following her harsh, pointed gaze directly toward my lonely table. Unfortunately, Jessica continued raising her voice so it echoed loudly through the speakers. "When you entrust the fine, delicate details of a high society evening to someone who grew up eating canned food on a discount couch, you cannot really expect champagne results. We tried to integrate some new, let us call it working class help into the family planning committee this year, but clearly some people simply lack the basic pedigree to understand how things are done in our world." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the elegant crowd. Several older women covered their mouths in horror. The insult was not subtle. It was a direct, vicious public execution. She was blaming me for the entire disaster, punishing me for my quiet rebellion by humiliating my family roots in front of hundreds of people. I felt the blood completely drain from my face. My heart pounded so hard it physically hurt my chest. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of her words hung heavily in the dead, quiet air. She had crossed a massive, terrifying line. She did not just insult me. She insulted my hard-working father. She insulted my entire humble childhood. I slowly looked away from Jessica and turned my eyes directly toward Robert. He was standing just a few feet away from his sister, right at the edge of the polished wooden stage. This was the moment. This was the ultimate deciding test of our entire marriage. I waited, holding my breath for my husband to step forward. I waited for him to take the microphone from his vicious sister and defend the mother of his unborn child. I waited for him to finally, unequivocally choose me. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles turning completely white. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Jessica stood proudly on the stage, entirely unbothered by the shocking cruelty of her own words. She simply smiled, a deeply arrogant expression, convinced she had won the silent war. She had put the working-class girl right back in her proper subordinate place. Robert stood completely frozen at the edge of the stage. He looked at Jessica, his eyes wide with genuine panic. Then he looked out across the sea of staring wealthy guests. He saw the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of his most important corporate clients. He saw the potential scandal brewing right in front of him. Finally, he looked directly at me. His eyes met mine across the massive, crowded ballroom. I saw the desperate, pleading look on his face. It was a look I recognized perfectly. I had seen it 100 times before. It was the exact look he gave me whenever Margaret made a passive-aggressive comment at Sunday dinner. It was the silent coward begging of a man asking his wife to absorb the heavy blow to keep the fragile peace. He wanted me to lower my head. He wanted me to smile apologetically and accept the horrific public insult so the wealthy guests would not feel any more discomfort. He prioritized the polished fake image of his elite family over my basic human dignity. He did not take the microphone. He did not say a single word. Robert simply looked down at his expensive, polished leather shoes, entirely complicit in his absolute terrible silence. The profound betrayal hit me harder than a physical strike. It was a completely suffocating, crushing realization. For 5 long years, I believed that if things got truly bad, if his family ever truly crossed the line into outright cruelty, Robert would stand up and protect me. I believed his love for me was stronger than his fear of his mother and sister. Standing in that silent judging ballroom, the painful truth was finally undeniably clear. I was entirely alone. I was the dedicated shield for a man who would gladly watch me bleed if it kept his expensive suit clean. I slowly stood up from my chair. My body felt incredibly heavy, weighed down by my pregnancy and the crushing reality of my failed marriage. The loud scraping sound of my chair pushing back echoed sharply through the dead quiet room. Every single pair of eyes instantly locked onto me. The wealthy donors, the terrified caterers, and the cruel, arrogant family on the stage all watched me stand up. I did not cry. There were absolutely no tears left in my tired eyes. There was only a cold, profound, unshakable clarity. The invisible burden I had carried for years completely evaporated, replaced by a massive, undeniable surge of absolute self-respect. I grabbed my small silver clutch from the table. I did not rush toward the heavy exit doors. I turned my body, and I began walking slowly, deliberately straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, heading directly toward the brightly lit stage. The wealthy guests parted immediately, their expensive gowns rustling as they stepped out of my path. I walked with my head held high, my posture perfectly straight, supporting the heavy weight of my unborn daughter. I was not the terrified, overcompensating girl they thought I was. I was the proud, resilient daughter of a hard-working factory man, and I was absolutely done running away. Robert watched me approach his face completely pale, covered in a sheen of nervous sweat. "Amanda." "Please, Robert," whispered desperately, holding his hands up as I reached the bottom of the wooden stage stairs. "Please do not make a huge scene here. Let us just go home." I ignored him entirely. I stepped past him, walking up the 3 short stairs directly onto the stage. Margaret gasped loudly, taking a frightened step backward. Jessica completely lost her arrogant smirk. She clutched the silver microphone to her chest, her eyes widening in sudden, unexpected fear as I stopped just a few feet away from her. I reached out my hand. I did not yank the microphone away. I simply held my hand open, waiting with absolute, unwavering authority. Jessica's hands were trembling visibly. She looked at her mother for help, but Margaret was completely frozen, terrified of the massive public spectacle unfolding. Slowly, reluctantly, Jessica placed the heavy silver microphone into my waiting hand. I turned to face the massive, quiet crowd. The bright stage lights beat down heavily on my tired face, but I did not blink. I looked out over the sea of incredibly wealthy, judgmental people, and I finally found my true voice. "I am not going to apologize for the state of this evening," I said, my voice echoing clearly and calmly through the large speakers. I did not organize a single detail of this event. For the past 5 years, I was the one who planned every gala, every charity dinner, and every perfect, seamless family holiday. I spent countless exhausting hours hiding behind the scenes, making sure Margaret and Jessica looked absolutely flawless to all of you. A low murmur rippled through the front rows. Margaret's face turned a deep, sickly shade of red. She tried to step forward to stop me, but I raised my free hand, a sharp, commanding gesture that froze her entirely in her tracks. I did it because I loved my husband. I continued, my voice breaking slightly but remaining incredibly strong. I did it because I believed that endless silent sacrifice was the only way to earn respect in this family. I swallowed every cruel comment. I ignored every insult about my working-class father and my humble childhood. I made myself incredibly small so they could feel incredibly tall. I turned my head slowly and looked directly at Robert. He was standing at the base of the stairs, looking absolutely destroyed. But the hardest part was not the cruelty of these two women, I said, maintaining direct, heartbreaking eye contact with my husband. The hardest part was the absolute crushing silence of the man who promised to protect me. I stood here tonight and watched my sister-in-law publicly humiliate my family roots, and I watched my husband lower his eyes to the floor and say absolutely nothing. Robert closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his pale cheek. The public shame was finally entirely unbearable for him. The harsh, undeniable truth of his cowardice was broadcasted to every single person he respected. I turned back to face the quiet, stunned audience. My father worked in a loud, dirty manufacturing factory for 40 long years, I said, my voice filled with immense, unadulterated pride. He wore heavy leather work boots, and his hands were permanently calloused. He never owned a tailored tuxedo. He never stepped foot inside a country club, but he was a profoundly good, honorable man. He taught me the true value of hard work and the absolute necessity of self-respect. He would be entirely disgusted by the hollow, arrogant cruelty in this room tonight. I looked at Jessica, who was staring down at her expensive shoes, completely humiliated by her own exposed venom. I looked at Margaret, whose perfect aristocratic facade was entirely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. "I am done," I announced, the final two words carrying a massive, undeniable weight of absolute freedom. I am officially done being the invisible shock absorber for a family that possesses immense wealth, but absolutely zero basic human decency. I am no longer carrying the heavy toxic burden of your massive insecurities. I turned to Robert one final time. He looked up at me, his face completely broken, realizing the absolute magnitude of what he had just permanently lost. The emotional disconnect in our marriage was laid entirely bare, exposed under the harsh, unforgiving stage lights. If you want to save your precious family image, Robert, you are going to have to do it completely by yourself, I said quietly. The microphone picking up the devastating, final truth of my words, because I am going home. And from this exact moment forward, I am only protecting myself and my daughter. I reached over to the wooden podium and set the heavy silver microphone down gently. A loud, sharp click echoed through the speakers, finalizing the end of the entire spectacle. I did not wait for a single reaction. I turned my back on the stage, the cruel family, and the entire room full of judgmental elites. I walked slowly down the wooden stairs, gripping the handrail carefully. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was a heavy, profound silence born from genuine shock and the undeniable recognition of brutal, honest truth. As I walked back down the long center aisle, not a single person whispered. Not a single person moved to stop me. I reached the heavy brass double doors of the country club. I pushed them open, stepping out into the cool, crisp night air. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the ballroom completely vanished, replaced by the fresh, clean smell of the quiet city streets. I walked over to the valet stand, handed the young attendant my ticket, and waited patiently for my car. A few minutes later, the valet pulled my modest sedan up to the curb. I tipped him generously, opened the heavy door, and climbed into the comfortable driver's seat. I started the engine, the quiet hum of the motor acting as a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. I did not look back at the massive, brightly lit country club. I drove away from the toxic, arrogant world, feeling an incredible, deeply profound sense of absolute peace wash entirely over me. The invisible chains were finally broken. The massive, heavy burden was lifted. I was driving back to my quiet suburban house completely alone, but for the very first time in 5 long years, I finally felt entirely free. The drive home was incredibly quiet. The dark, familiar streets of our suburban neighborhood felt like a safe haven. I pulled my modest sedan into the concrete driveway. I turned off the engine and sat in the absolute silence for a few long minutes. My hands were resting softly on the top of the steering wheel. My heart rate, which had been pounding wildly in my chest, finally slowed to a normal, steady rhythm. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the dark house. The quiet was immediate and deeply comforting. I did not turn on the bright overhead lights. I walked slowly down the hallway using the soft glow of the street lamps shining through the front windows. I kicked off my uncomfortable low heels, leaving them abandoned near the entryway. My swollen feet throbbed, but it was a completely normal physical pain. The heavy, suffocating emotional pain was entirely gone. I walked into my quiet bedroom. I unzipped the beautiful dark blue maternity gown, letting it fall heavily to the floor. I put on my softest, oversized cotton pajamas. I washed the bold red lipstick completely off my tired face. I looked at myself in the large bathroom mirror. I looked incredibly pale and deeply exhausted, but my dark eyes were completely clear. There was no fear left in them. There was no desperate, lingering need for external validation. I walked back into the dark kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. I sat down at the granite island, resting my hands entirely on my pregnant belly. I was not waiting up for Robert. I was simply enjoying the profound, beautiful peace of my own quiet home. 45 minutes later, the bright headlights of Robert's expensive car swept across the front living room window. I heard the heavy car door slam shut. I heard the frantic, aggressive jingle of his keys. The heavy wooden front door swung open violently, hitting the hallway wall with a loud, sharp thud. Robert stormed into the house. He was completely disheveled. His expensive tuxedo jacket was missing entirely. His crisp white shirt was wrinkled and damp with sweat. His face was flushed bright red, a mixture of pure exhaustion and intense lingering panic. He saw the dim light shining from the kitchen and marched straight toward me. Amanda Robert shouted, his voice cracking with intense defensive anger. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Do you realize the absolute catastrophic nightmare you just created for my family?" I sat perfectly still on the kitchen stool. I took a slow, calm sip of my cold water. I did not answer him. He paced furiously back and forth across the ceramic tile. "You completely ruined the entire charity gala." Robert continued, running a trembling hand through his messy hair. "My mother is absolutely hysterical. Jessica is crying in the country club bathroom, refusing to come out. 2 of my biggest corporate clients walked out the front door right after your dramatic little speech. You humiliated us in front of the entire city." He waited for me to argue back. He fully expected me to raise my voice. He wanted a loud, explosive fight so he could justify his intense anger. He needed me to engage with his frantic energy to validate his deep defensive panic. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I looked at him with a calm, steady, unblinking gaze. The silence in the kitchen stretched on heavy and incredibly thick. Robert stopped pacing. He stared at me, his chest heaving heavily. "Why are you just sitting there?" Robert demanded, his voice dropping slightly but still laced with bitter accusation. "Are you proud of yourself? Are you happy that you finally destroyed my relationship with my mother?" "You destroyed it, Robert," I replied quietly, my voice barely above a soft whisper. "I just finally stopped trying to hold it all together for you." He scoffed loudly, shaking his head in stubborn, desperate denial. "That is completely ridiculous," he muttered, leaning heavily against the granite counter. "You always take things entirely out of proportion." Jessica made a stupid, thoughtless joke. "You should have just let it go. You did not have to publicly execute her on a stage in front of 500 people. I traced the rim of my cold water glass. "It was not a joke, Robert," I said calmly. "It was a calculated, vicious insult. And you stood there in silence and let her deliver it." He looked away from me quickly, unable to meet my calm, steady eyes. I was trying to de-escalate the situation. Robert argued weakly, his defensive tone beginning to falter under the crushing weight of reality. I did not want to cause a massive scene. "You did not want to cause a scene," I repeated softly, nodding my head in slow understanding. "You were completely fine with my absolute humiliation. You were completely fine with my father being mocked. You just did not want your wealthy friends to feel uncomfortable." The devastating, undeniable truth of my words finally pierced through his thick defensive armor. The manic, angry energy suddenly completely drained out of his large body. He looked down at his expensive, scuffed leather shoes. The quiet house which I had filled with absolute peace now forced him to confront the loud, terrifying reality of his own cowardice. He slowly pulled a heavy wooden chair away from the kitchen table and collapsed into it. He rested his elbows on his knees and buried his tired face entirely in his hands. The silence wrapped around us again, but this time it was not the tense, suffocating silence of a standoff. It was the heavy, mournful silence of a man finally recognizing the massive, catastrophic failure of his own actions. He sat there for a long time, completely motionless. The anger was gone. The defensive excuses were gone. He was finally painfully reflecting on the brutal, honest truth I had delivered on that brightly lit stage. He was finally beginning to understand exactly what he had sacrificed to keep his toxic family perfectly comfortable. The digital clock on the oven glowed a dim green, showing 2 a.m. The quiet ticking of the hallway clock seemed incredibly loud in the heavy silence. Robert slowly lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were red and deeply bloodshot. The arrogant corporate executive was completely gone. He looked like a profoundly tired, broken man. Amanda Robert whispered, his voice cracking painfully in the quiet room. "I am so incredibly sorry. I did not mean to leave you alone up there. I just completely froze." I kept my hands resting gently on my pregnant belly. "Freezing in a moment of panic is a natural human reaction, Robert," I replied softly, my voice completely devoid of anger. "But your silence tonight was not a sudden mistake. It was a practiced daily habit. You have been freezing for 5 long years." He swallowed hard, looking down at the smooth granite counter. "I did not see it." Robert admitted, his voice barely a quiet rasp. "I honestly thought you were just better at handling them. My mother is a very difficult, demanding woman. She has been that way my entire life. When you came along, you smoothed everything out so perfectly. You made the family holidays actually bearable. I was just so incredibly grateful to have a buffer that I completely ignored the heavy price you were paying." I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the undeniable weight of his honest confession. "You used me as a human shield, Robert," I said, clearly watching his face wince in absolute pain. "You knew exactly how toxic and deeply judgmental they were. You spent your entire childhood walking on eggshells around Margaret. But instead of drawing a firm boundary to protect our marriage, you simply handed the heavy eggshells to me. You asked me to walk on them so you could finally rest." He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "I am so sorry." He repeated the words, sounding hollow against the massive mountain of my exhausted sacrifices. "Saying you are sorry does not heal the deep, lingering damage, Robert." I continued, my voice remaining incredibly calm and steady. "For 5 years, I slowly erased my own vibrant personality. I hid my working-class roots. I pretended to love expensive imported wines that tasted like bitter vinegar. I spent thousands of dollars buying luxurious silk scarves just to earn a tiny, condescending smile from your mother. I did it all because I wanted to be worthy of you." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute, genuine heartbreak. "You were always worthy of me," Amanda Robert pleaded, reaching his hand across the cold table. "You are the best thing that ever happened to my completely messed up family." I did not reach back. I kept my hands firmly on my own lap. "Then why did you let them treat me like a disposable hired servant?" I asked, the painful question hanging heavily in the quiet kitchen air. "Why did you sit at that dinner table week after week and watch your sister insult my intelligence? Why did you let your mother constantly mock my hardworking father?" Robert pulled his hand back, resting it heavily on his own knee. "Because I am a complete coward," he confessed, the brutal, honest truth finally spilling out of his mouth. "I was absolutely terrified of my own mother. She controls the family narrative. If I stood up to her, she would completely freeze me out. She would cut me off emotionally and ruin my professional reputation within her elite social circle. I was so incredibly scared of losing my comfortable place in the family that I completely sacrificed my own wife." The sheer vulnerability of his admission shifted the thick atmosphere in the kitchen. The defensiveness was entirely permanently gone. He was no longer trying to protect his fragile ego. He was finally looking at the raw, bleeding wound he had actively helped create. I watched his broad shoulders shake as he silently cried. It was a shocking, deeply profound sight. The man who always wore perfectly tailored suits and commanded entire corporate boardrooms was entirely undone. He was crying for the beautiful equal partnership he had recklessly squandered. He was mourning the incredible trust I used to have in him. "You chose the path of least resistance." "Robert," I pointed out, my voice softening just a fraction, but retaining its unbreakable steel. "You chose your own comfort over my basic human dignity. Every single time Margaret made a cruel comment about my clothes, and you stared down at your plate, you sent me a very clear, devastating message. You told me that I did not actually matter. You told me that keeping your mother happy was vastly more important than keeping your wife safe." "I am a terrible husband," Robert whispered, burying his face back into his trembling hands. "I do not deserve you, Amanda. I do not deserve the incredible grace you have shown this family." I leaned back against the kitchen stool, feeling the familiar dull ache in my lower back. I felt a small, gentle kick against my ribs. I looked down at my large belly, feeling a profound surge of protective maternal instinct. "We are having a daughter, Robert," I said softly, looking back up into his tired, tear-filled eyes. "In exactly 8 weeks, we are going to bring a beautiful, innocent baby girl into this messy world." He nodded slowly, fresh tears brimming in his eyes at the mere mention of our unborn child. He looked completely desperate, clinging to the thought of our expanding family as his absolute final lifeline. I am not going to let our daughter grow up in a house where her mother is treated like a second-class citizen. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute unbreakable resolve. I am not going to let her learn that a woman must constantly shrink herself to keep a toxic man comfortable. I refuse to pass this heavy, invisible burden down to the next generation. I will not teach her that love requires endless, silent suffering. Robert wiped his wet face with the back of his trembling hand. He sat up entirely straight, abandoning his broken posture. The sheer panic and regret slowly morphed into a desperate, clinging determination. You do not have to, Amanda. Robert promised, his voice filled with a desperate, heavy sincerity. I swear to you, things are going to be entirely different. I will never let them speak to you like that again. I will do whatever it takes to fix this massive, terrible mistake. I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are my only priority. I looked at him, studying the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his pale face. He was truly listening. He finally understood the absolute devastating magnitude of his negligence. The painful late-night conversation was slowly tearing down the fake polite walls of our broken marriage. We were finally standing in the raw, messy truth, and it was the very first step toward a genuine realignment. The heavy silence returned to the quiet kitchen, but this time it was a profound silence built on complete, absolute honesty. The quiet in the kitchen deepened, settling around us like a heavy protective blanket. Robert did not look away from me. He took a long, trembling breath. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had done absolutely nothing to protect his pregnant wife for 5 long years. I took you completely for granted, Amanda, Robert said, his voice raw and filled with genuine, profound shame. I sat back and I watched you completely exhaust yourself every single day. I watched you run to 3 different stores just to find the exact specific wine Jessica demanded. I knew you were in physical pain from the pregnancy, but I never once told you to stop. I let you do it because it kept them off my back. He shook his head, a gesture of absolute, unadulterated self-disgust. I remember our wedding day. Robert continued, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. I remember watching my mother relegate your wonderful, hard-working parents to the very back of the reception hall. I saw the quiet, devastating hurt in your eyes. I knew it was incredibly wrong. But I did not walk over there and move their table. I stood at the open bar drinking expensive champagne, and I told myself it was just a minor compromise to keep the peace. I listened to his words, feeling a strange, validating warmth mix with the lingering pain in my chest. He was finally seeing the exact specific moments that had slowly broken my heart. It was never a minor compromise, Robert, I replied quietly, feeling the baby shift gently against my ribs. Every single time you stayed silent, you chipped away a little piece of my basic dignity. You taught them that I was entirely disposable. I know, he whispered, wiping his wet face with the sleeve of his wrinkled white shirt. I see it so clearly now. I was so incredibly focused on avoiding my mother and her massive dramatic tantrums. I prioritized their ridiculous, aristocratic comfort over your absolute fundamental dignity. I let them treat you like a personal servant because I was too weak to challenge the toxic system I grew up in. Robert leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the cool granite counter. I remember when my mother insulted your father at the Sunday dinner last month, Robert said, his voice dropping an octave heavy with crushing regret. I was sitting right there at the head of the table. I heard her call his factory job loud and dirty. I saw you flinch, Amanda. I saw you bite the inside of your cheek to keep from crying. And what did I do? I completely changed the subject and asked my sister about her upcoming vacation. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh directed entirely at himself. "What kind of a man does that?" Robert asked, staring blankly at the dark kitchen window. "What kind of a husband watches his own wife absorb that kind of absolute targeted cruelty and just casually changes the subject? I completely abandoned you right in your own dining room. I abandoned you every single time they walked through our front door." I did not offer him a polite, comforting excuse. I did not tell him that he was a basically good man who simply made a mistake. He needed to feel the absolute unvarnished weight of his own severe negligence. He needed to sit in the uncomfortable burning fire of his own terrible choices. "You abandoned me because it was easy, Robert," I stated, my voice perfectly clear and completely uncompromising. "It is incredibly easy to let someone else carry the heavy bags. It is incredibly easy to ignore the massive problem when you are not the one actively bleeding." He nodded slowly, accepting the harsh, undeniable truth of my words. "You are absolutely right," he agreed, his voice completely stripped of any remaining pride. It was entirely about my own ease. I took your incredible, endless grace completely for granted. I assumed you would just keep taking the hits forever. I never once stopped to consider the massive, crushing toll it was taking on your soul. I completely failed you, Amanda. I failed you in every single meaningful way a husband can fail a wife." He looked around the empty, quiet kitchen. He looked at the clean ceramic floors and the perfectly organized pantry. He finally realized that the perfectly ordered house was built entirely on my silent, exhausted suffering. He saw the invisible labor, the endless emotional management, and the constant crushing anxiety that fueled his completely effortless life. "I let them walk all over you," Robert said, his voice thick with a brand new, terrifying realization. "I prioritized a fake toxic family image over the only woman who ever genuinely loved me. I traded your absolute dignity for a few hours of quiet, polite dinners. It is the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of my entire life." The raw, unfiltered honesty hung heavily in the cool morning air. For the very first time in our entire relationship, Robert was fully, completely accountable. There were no defensive excuses. There was no blaming his mother or her older generation. There was only a man staring directly at the immense, undeniable wreckage of his own severe negligence. I looked at him, seeing the profound, irreversible shift in his dark eyes. The comfortable, oblivious husband was entirely gone. He was finally painfully awake. I watched the profound realization settle completely over his tired features. The kitchen was entirely quiet, except for the low, steady hum of the stainless steel refrigerator. "It is easy to apologize in the quiet dark of our kitchen, Robert," I said, my voice gentle but incredibly firm. "It is entirely different to actually stand up in the glaring light of day and completely change the system. I do not need your profound guilt right now. I need your absolute concrete action." He sat up straighter, wiping his red eyes one final time. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a very long, very deep sleep. "Tell me exactly what you need me to do, Amanda," he said, his voice finding a new, solid resonance in the quiet room. "Tell me exactly what the new rules are. I will do whatever it takes to fix this massive failure." I leaned forward slightly, resting my tired hands on the cool granite counter. First, I began laying out the new, unbreakable foundation of our marriage. I am completely, permanently retiring from the family management business. I will no longer buy a single expensive birthday gift. I will no longer organize the holiday dinners or the stressful Sunday brunches. If your mother has a birthday coming up, you will remember it on your own. If she wants a specific luxury gift, you will drive to the downtown boutique and you will buy it. You will wrap it yourself. Robert nodded immediately without a single second of hesitation. Done, he agreed softly, keeping his eyes locked directly on mine. I will manage every single holiday and every single gift from this exact moment forward. I will put the reminders in my own personal phone. You will never have to think about it again. Second, I continued, my voice steady and entirely clear. All direct communication goes directly through you. I am officially blocking Margaret and Jessica on my personal cell phone tomorrow morning. I am no longer answering their passive-aggressive text messages. If they want to know how the baby is doing, they can call you. If they want to invite us to an exclusive country club luncheon, they will ask you. And you will not automatically accept their invitations without discussing it privately with me first. I am no longer their personal, convenient, unpaid secretary. I completely understand, Robert said, nodding his head slowly. I will tell them that any and all family plans must be coordinated exclusively through me. You are completely off the hook, Amanda. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to lay down the most critical, difficult boundary of all. And finally, I said, leaning closer to him across the wide kitchen island, the absolute moment either of them disrespects me, the visit is entirely immediately over. If we are sitting at a nice restaurant and Jessica mocks my background or my career, you will immediately ask the waiter for the check, and we will walk out the front door. If Margaret criticizes my cooking while standing in our own home, you will pack up her expensive cashmere coat, and you will ask her to leave our property. I paused, letting the heavy, absolute finality of my words hang in the air. You will not try to change the subject, Robert, I stated, my voice ringing with unbreakable authority. You will not try to smooth it over with a polite joke. You will become the absolute, unbreakable shield that you promised to be on the day we got married. The heavy kitchen air felt incredibly charged with the massive weight of this specific demand. For Robert, this meant declaring outright terrifying war on his mother and her lifetime of toxic, manipulative control. It meant finally facing the exact terrifying family confrontation he had spent his entire adult life trying to actively avoid. It meant finally growing up and completely separating from his childhood dynamic. Robert looked at me, his dark eyes filled with absolute, unwavering determination. He did not flinch. He did not try to negotiate the terms or soften the strict rules. If they utter a single disrespectful word about you or your hardworking family, I will cut the visit short instantly, Robert stated, his voice ringing with absolute, genuine authority. I do not care if we are in the middle of a massive public charity gala. I do not care if it is right in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. If they cannot treat you with basic common human decency, they will not have access to our family. They will not have access to my amazing wife, and they will absolutely not have access to our newborn daughter. I looked at his face carefully, searching for any lingering trace of the cowardly, passive man I used to know. He was completely, permanently gone. In his place sat a true equal partner, finally ready to step up and carry his fair share of the heavy relational burden. He was finally choosing me over the comfortable, toxic approval of his aristocratic mother. I believe you, Robert, I whispered, feeling a massive physical weight finally lift entirely off my tired, aching shoulders. I will prove it to you, Amanda Robert promised, standing up slowly from the wooden chair. Tomorrow morning, before I even go into the corporate office, I am driving directly to my mother house. I am going to sit in her perfectly manicured living room, and I am going to tell her exactly how things are going to be from now on. I am going to tell her that you are the absolute center of my entire life, and her future access to us is entirely contingent on her absolute respect for you. He walked slowly around the kitchen island. He stopped right in front of me. He did not reach out to grab me or force an emotional hug. He simply stood there, offering his quiet, deeply respectful presence. "I am so incredibly proud of you," Amanda Roberts said softly, looking down at me with immense, unadulterated admiration. "You stood up on that massive, brightly lit stage tonight, and you demanded the respect that I should have been demanding for you for the past 5 years. You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known. And I swear to you on my own life, you will never have to fight my family alone ever again." I reached out my hand and gently placed it right over his warm palm. It was not a magical instant fix. The deep, lingering emotional wounds of the past 5 years would take a considerable amount of time to fully heal. There would undoubtedly be difficult, highly uncomfortable days ahead as his deeply entitled family violently resisted the new strict boundaries. But for the very first time in our entire marriage, we were finally standing on the exact same side of the invisible battle line. "Let us go to bed, Robert," I said quietly, a genuine soft smile finally touching my tired lips. "We have a lot of resting to do." He gently helped me stand up from the tall kitchen stool. He wrapped his warm arm securely around my waist, supporting my heavy pregnant belly as I stepped down. We walked slowly out of the quiet kitchen, Robert reaching back to turn off the dim overhead lights. We walked down the long, dark hallway, leaning slightly against each other. The silent, exhausting protest was officially permanently over. The heavy, painful, completely necessary rebuilding of our broken marriage had finally begun. The transition from winter to spring was entirely beautiful. 3 full months had passed since the disastrous charity gala. The air in our suburban home was no longer thick with suffocating anxiety. Instead, it was filled with the soft, sweet sounds of our newborn daughter. We named her Lily. She had a full head of dark curls and the brightest, most curious brown eyes. I sat comfortably on the soft living room sofa, holding Lily against my chest. She was sleeping soundly, swaddled in a pale pink blanket. I felt a profound, deep sense of absolute peace. The heavy, invisible burden I carried for 5 long years was entirely gone. Robert walked into the bright living room carrying 2 warm ceramic mugs of herbal tea. He looked tired with deep circles under his eyes from the long, sleepless nights. But he looked incredibly happy. The constant defensive tension in his broad shoulders had completely vanished. He handed me a warm mug and sat down right beside me, wrapping his arm securely around my waist. We were expecting visitors this afternoon. It was the very first time Margaret and Jessica were allowed inside our home since Lily was born. Robert had laid down the strict, unbreakable ground rules exactly as he promised. He drove to his mother house the morning after the gala, and he delivered a very clear, uncompromising ultimatum. He told them that any disrespect toward me would result in immediate permanent excommunication from our lives. Margaret was entirely furious at first. She tried to deploy her usual manipulative guilt trips. She cried and she threatened to cut him out of the family will. But Robert simply stood up, told her he loved her, and walked out her heavy front door. He completely ignored her frantic text messages for 3 solid weeks. He showed her that the old toxic system of control was entirely dead. When Margaret finally realized that he was absolutely serious, her aristocratic arrogance entirely collapsed. She desperately wanted access to her new granddaughter, so she finally agreed to his strict, unyielding terms. The doorbell chimed softly, echoing through the quiet house. Robert immediately stood up, smoothing his casual cotton shirt. "I will handle this, Amanda," Robert said, his voice completely calm and entirely reassuring. "You just stay right here and relax with the baby." He walked down the long hallway and pulled the heavy wooden front door open. I listened closely as the distinct sharp clicking of expensive leather boots echoed into the entryway. Margaret and Jessica walked into the house bringing a cloud of heavy floral perfume with them. But the atmosphere was entirely different this time. They did not immediately start barking orders. They walked into the living room looking incredibly stiff and deeply uncomfortable. Margaret stopped near the edge of the soft rug, staring at the sleeping baby in my arms. "Oh my goodness," Margaret whispered, her voice softening just a fraction as she looked at her beautiful granddaughter. "She is absolutely precious." "Hello, Margaret," I said calmly, not making any move to stand up. "Hello, Jessica." Jessica offered a tight, forced smile, clutching her expensive designer handbag tightly against her side. She looked terrified to say the wrong thing. Margaret stepped closer, peering down at Lily. "She has Robert nose," Margaret noted, reaching out a hesitant manicured hand to touch the soft pink blanket. "It is a very strong, prominent family feature. I am so relieved she inherited our refined bone structure." It was a subtle classic Margaret comment. It was a tiny passive-aggressive dig implying that my own physical features were somehow inferior. In the past, Robert would have completely ignored the subtle slight. He would have looked away, desperate to keep the fragile peace. But today, Robert did not hesitate for a single second. He stepped right directly between his mother and the living room sofa. "Actually," Mom Robert stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unmistakable authority, "Lily has Amanda beautiful dark eyes and Amanda perfect curly hair. We are incredibly lucky that she looks so much like her amazing mother." Margaret physically flinched, pulling her manicured hand back quickly. She looked up at her tall son, her eyes wide with sudden, genuine shock. She was completely unused to him challenging her public narrative so directly. She opened her mouth to argue, her aristocratic pride instinctively flaring up. Robert simply raised his hand, stopping her completely in her tracks. "We are keeping the comments positive and entirely respectful today," Robert reminded her, his tone perfectly even, but laced with a very clear, dangerous warning. "Remember the conversation we had in your living room, Mom. If we cannot maintain a respectful environment, the visit ends right now." The silence in the living room was incredibly thick. Jessica practically stopped breathing, waiting to see what her proud mother would do. I sat perfectly still, holding my beautiful sleeping daughter. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety. I watched my husband stand tall and completely unwavering, acting as the absolute unbreakable shield he promised to be. Margaret swallowed hard, her pristine posture faltering slightly. She looked at Robert, realizing that he was completely willing to point toward the front door. The fake aristocratic queen finally surrendered to the undeniable reality of his boundaries. "Of course," Margaret replied quickly, forcing a very polite, incredibly strained smile onto her pale face. "I meant absolutely no offense. Amanda is glowing. You both created a beautiful child." "Thank you, Mom," Robert said, the tension slowly leaving his broad shoulders. "Why do you not sit down on the armchair and Amanda can let you hold her for a few minutes?" The rest of the short visit was incredibly polite and entirely superficial. Margaret and Jessica sat awkwardly in the living room, drinking the water Robert poured for them. They did not make a single comment about the house, my clothes, or my family background. They were terrified of crossing the massive, invisible electric fence Robert had built entirely around me. When they finally left 30 minutes later, the heavy front door clicked shut softly. Robert walked back into the living room and let out a long, heavy exhale. He sat down next to me on the sofa, wrapping his arms around both me and our sleeping baby. He kissed the top of my head, a deep, lingering gesture of absolute devotion. "You did perfectly," I whispered, leaning my tired head against his strong shoulder. "I am never going back to the way things were," Amanda Robert promised, his voice thick with genuine, unbreakable conviction. You are my family now. You and Lily are the only things that truly matter. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. The toxic, arrogant monsters had not completely disappeared, but they were finally securely locked outside the gates of our quiet, peaceful life. I was entirely safe, and for the very first time, I felt truly, unconditionally cherished. Later that exact same evening, the house settled into a deep, profound silence. I walked softly into the dimly lit nursery, holding Lily against my chest. She was completely asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in a perfect steady rhythm. I gently lowered her into the soft wooden crib. I stood there for a very long time, resting my tired hands on the smooth wooden railing, just watching her breathe. The small nightlight cast a warm golden glow across the quiet room. I walked over to the comfortable rocking chair and sat down slowly. I leaned my tired head back and closed my eyes. The absolute incredible contentment I felt in that specific moment was entirely new to me. It was a deep, quiet joy completely untouched by any lingering anxiety or looming suffocating fear. For 5 long years, I had lived my entire life waiting for the other shoe to drop. I woke up every single morning carrying a massive invisible ledger in my tired mind. I constantly tallied the endless chores, the frantic errands, and the heavy emotional sacrifices I needed to make just to balance the scales. I truly believed deep down in my core that my value as a human being was directly tied to how much pain I could silently endure. I thought that if I just suffered enough, if I just made myself incredibly small and endlessly useful, I would finally earn my proper place in their elite, arrogant world. But sitting in the quiet nursery, I finally understood the massive, tragic flaw in that deeply toxic logic. Love is not a transactional currency that you have to constantly work to earn. True value does not come from absorbing the cruel, careless blows of insecure people. My worth was never defined by how perfectly I could roast a Sunday dinner or how smoothly I could navigate a high society charity gala. My worth was inherent. It was absolute. It was completely untouchable. I looked at the simple, beautiful life I had finally permanently reclaimed. I did not have to pretend to be an aristocratic socialite anymore. I was Amanda. I was the proud, resilient daughter of a hard-working factory man. I was a talented graphic designer. And most importantly, I was a fierce, protective mother who had the absolute courage to break a toxic cycle before it could ever touch her innocent child. The door to the nursery creaked open softly. Robert stepped into the warm room, walking quietly across the thick carpet. He stood right beside my rocking chair, looking down into the wooden crib. A soft, genuine smile touched his tired face. He reached down and gently adjusted the pale pink blanket covering our sleeping daughter. He did not say a single word for a very long time. He simply stood there, sharing the profound, beautiful quiet of the room. It was a highly comfortable, entirely safe silence. It was not the heavy, tense silence that used to suffocate our broken marriage. It was the peaceful silence of 2 equal partners standing firmly on the exact same side of the invisible battle line. "I'm so incredibly glad that we are finally here," Robert whispered, keeping his voice incredibly low so he would not wake the baby. I spent so much precious time worrying about what my family thought of me. I completely missed the incredible, beautiful life that was sitting right in front of my face. I reached out and took his warm hand. He intertwined his fingers with mine, holding on with a firm, deeply reassuring grip. "We are here now, Robert," I replied softly, looking up into his clear, dark eyes. "The past is completely permanently behind us. We are building our own family now, strictly on our own terms." He nodded slowly, a look of absolute unwavering devotion washing over his face. "I will never take this peace for granted again, Amanda," he promised, his voice filled with absolute genuine sincerity. "I will spend every single day of my life making sure you know exactly how much I respect you." I believed him entirely. The massive fundamental shift in his character was completely undeniable. He had finally learned that true strength does not come from avoiding uncomfortable conflict. True strength comes from standing up and fiercely protecting the people you love, even when it is incredibly terrifying. He had finally stepped up to carry his fair share of the heavy relational burden, and the resulting freedom was absolutely beautiful. We walked out of the quiet nursery together, leaving the wooden door slightly cracked. We walked down the long hallway toward our own bedroom. The house was not perfectly flawlessly clean. There were a few dishes sitting quietly in the kitchen sink. There was a pile of folded laundry resting on the living room sofa. But the house felt warmer and infinitely more inviting than it ever had before. It was no longer a pristine, stressful museum designed to impress arrogant, judgmental guests. It was a real living home. It was a safe, warm sanctuary built on genuine mutual respect and unconditional love. The invisible burden was completely lifted. The quiet, silent protest had successfully revolutionized our entire world. I climbed into the soft bed, pulling the heavy blankets all the way up to my chin. I did not set a loud alarm for the morning. I did not have a frantic, stressful mental list of endless chores to complete for Robert. I knew that when the sun finally rose, we would tackle the day together as a true equal partnership. I closed my eyes, letting the absolute profound peace wash entirely over my tired body. The long, exhausting war was officially over, and I had finally, truly won. A family built on the silent suffering of one person is destined to collapse. True strength lies in stepping back and allowing others to carry their own weight. Respect must be demanded, and love is only genuine when it actively protects the ones who need it most.